There are three moments in an empath's life that are so psychologically dangerous, so fundamentally destabilizing, that Carl Jung dedicated years of clinical research to understanding how people survive them. And here's what makes these moments truly deadly. They don't announce themselves with drama or crisis. They arrive quietly, almost invisibly, disguised as ordinary relationship dynamics, normal emotional exchanges, everyday interactions. But make no mistake, these three moments have the power to completely dismantle your sense of self, erode your psychological boundaries, and trap you in patterns of self-abandonment that can last decades. Jung called them critical thresholds of psychic dissolution, and he believed that without a specific survival protocol, empathic individuals would either lose themselves completely or be forced to shut down their empathy entirely just to survive. Today, we're going to identify these three deadly moments, understand why they're so dangerous, and most importantly, learn the exact survival protocol Jung developed to navigate them without losing yourself in the process. Carl Gustav Jung understood something that most psychologists of his era completely missed, that certain personality structures face unique existential threats that have nothing to do with traditional mental illness. Born in 1875 in Switzerland, Jung initially worked alongside Sigmund Freud, but eventually broke away to develop his own revolutionary approach to the human psyche. His work on psychological types, the collective unconscious, and the process of individuation created an entirely new framework for understanding human consciousness. But it was his clinical work with what he called the feeling types and introverted intuitives that led him to identify these three deadly moments. In his masterwork, Psychological Types, published in 1921, and later expanded in The Development of Personality from 1934, Jung documented case after case of highly empathic individuals who reached critical breaking points in their psychological development. These weren't people with diagnosable disorders. These were highly functional, deeply compassionate individuals who had reached what Jung termed thresholds of unbearable knowing. What Jung observed in his practice at the Burg-Hölzli Psychiatric Hospital and later in his private clinic was a pattern. Empathic individuals would come to him at specific junctures in their lives, often unable to articulate exactly what was wrong, but knowing at a soul level that something fundamental had shifted. They would describe feeling hollowed out, disconnected from themselves, or trapped in a kind of psychological quicksand where every attempt to help themselves only made things worse. Through decades of careful observation and therapeutic work, Jung identified three recurring moments that appeared again and again in the lives of these individuals. He called them moments of psychic emergency, and he believed that how a person navigated these moments would determine whether they achieved what he called individuation or remained trapped in what he termed unconscious identification with others. Now, before we explore these three moments, we need to understand what Jung meant by empathy, because it's different from how we use the term today. In the relations between the ego and the unconscious, Jung described certain individuals as having what he called psychic permeability. These people, he explained, had unusually thin boundaries between their own unconscious and the unconscious of others. They could sense things that remained hidden to most people. They could feel the emotional undercurrents in a room, detect lies not through logic but through something more visceral, and absorb the psychological states of those around them almost like psychic sponges. Jung didn't romanticize this ability. In fact, he saw it as a profound vulnerability, a kind of psychological exposure that required sophisticated defensive strategies just to maintain sanity. The first deadly moment Jung identified is what he called the recognition of non-reciprocity. This is the moment when you finally truly understand that the empathy you extend so naturally to others is not being reciprocated. Not because people are necessarily malicious, but because they simply don't have the same capacity or willingness to extend themselves the way you do. Let me be clear about what this moment actually is, because it's not just noticing that someone isn't as empathic as you. That's obvious and happens all the time. This deadly moment is different. It's the sudden, often devastating realization that you've been operating under a false assumption about how relationships work. You've unconsciously believed that if you just explain yourself well enough, care deeply enough, extend enough understanding, others will naturally reciprocate. And in this first deadly moment, you realize with absolute clarity that this is not true. It will never be true. And everything you've built your relational life on is fundamentally flawed. Jung documented this moment extensively in his work with patients. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he describes a patient who came to him after what she called a revelation that destroyed everything. She had spent years in a close friendship where she provided endless emotional support, careful listening, and deep understanding. One day, when she was going through a genuine crisis, she reached out to this friend expecting the same kind of support she had always provided. What she received instead was a superficial response, an obvious discomfort with her vulnerability, and a quick change of subject. Jung wrote that what made this moment deadly wasn't the friend's response itself, but what it revealed to his patient. This had always been the dynamic. She had always been the giver, and the friend had always been the taker. But she had been so busy giving that she had never stopped to notice the complete absence of reciprocity. This moment is deadly because it forces you to confront something terrifying. You might be alone in ways you never imagined. Not physically alone, but psychologically alone. You're surrounded by relationships, but in this moment, you see them clearly for what many of them are: one-sided performances where you play the role of understander, supporter, emotional container, while others play the role of receiver. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. Jung called this the removal of projections. You've been projecting your own capacity for deep empathy onto others, assuming they experience relationships the way you do. When those projections are stripped away, the reality underneath can be devastating. But here's what makes this moment not just painful, but genuinely dangerous: the conclusions you might draw from it. Jung observed that many empathic individuals, when faced with this recognition, go to one of two extremes. Either they blame themselves, thinking, "I must not be worthy of reciprocal care," or they become bitter and cynical, thinking, "No one is capable of real empathy." Both of these responses, Jung argued, are forms of what he called psychic inflation followed by deflation. You swing from believing you can create reciprocity through sheer force of empathic will to believing reciprocity doesn't exist at all. Neither is true, and both can trap you in destructive patterns. Jung's survival protocol for this first deadly moment is something he called conscious discrimination. In Psychological Types, he wrote that the individuated person must learn to discriminate between those capable of reciprocal relation and those who are not. This isn't judgment, Jung insisted, but discernment. It's the psychological skill of recognizing different levels of empathic capacity in different people and adjusting your investment accordingly. He used the metaphor of a gardener who doesn't plant orchids in desert soil. It's not that desert soil is bad, it's simply not the right environment for orchids. Similarly, some people are not capable of reciprocal empathic exchange. Not because they're bad people, but because they haven't developed that capacity. The survival protocol requires you to stop trying to grow orchids in desert soil and instead find the environments where reciprocity is actually possible. Let me give you a practical example of what this looks like. You have a colleague who frequently comes to you with problems, and you listen attentively, offer thoughtful insights, and provide genuine emotional support. One day, you try to share something you're struggling with, and you notice they respond with advice you didn't ask for, quickly redirect the conversation back to themselves, or simply seem uncomfortable and eager to exit the exchange. The old you would have tried harder, explained more carefully, or wondered what you did wrong. The survival protocol has you do something radically different. You accept the data. This person is not capable of or interested in reciprocal exchange. That's not a moral judgment, it's simply information, and you use that information to recalibrate the relationship. You remain friendly, professional, kind, but you stop investing your deep empathic energy where it cannot be reciprocated. Jung believed that this conscious discrimination was essential for psychological survival, because without it, you exhaust yourself trying to force reciprocity where the capacity doesn't exist, and you miss the relationships where genuine mutual exchange is possible. In The Development of Personality, he wrote, "The greatest burden the conscious personality can bear is the unconscious demand that all relationships be equal in depth and reciprocity. This is not nature's way. There are relationships of different depths, and the wise person knows the difference." Now, the second deadly moment Jung identified is even more insidious because it happens so gradually you often don't realize it's happening until it's nearly complete. Jung called this the dissolution of self through perpetual accommodation. This is the moment when you realize you've been shape-shifting for so long, accommodating so many different people's needs and expectations that you've lost track of who you actually are. Your preferences, your needs, your authentic responses, they've all been buried under layers and layers of accommodation. And in this deadly moment, someone asks you a simple question like, "What do you want?" or "How do you really feel about this?" And you realize with horror that you genuinely don't know. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work, particularly with women, though he noted it could happen to anyone with strong empathic wiring. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, he described what he called the persona trap. The persona, in Jung's framework, is the mask we wear in social situations, the role we play to function in society. It's necessary and healthy in moderation. But Jung observed that empathic individuals often develop what he called multiple adaptive personas. They become so skilled at reading what's needed in any given situation and providing it that they develop different versions of themselves for different people and contexts. The work colleague sees one version, the family sees another, friends see yet another, and none of these versions are fully authentic because each has been carefully calibrated to manage others' comfort and expectations. This moment becomes deadly when you realize you've lost the thread of your authentic self entirely. Jung called this ego dissolution through over-identification with the persona. You are the persona now. There's no self underneath to return to, because you've been accommodating for so long that the accommodating has become your entire identity. One of Jung's patients described it to him as feeling like a hologram. I appear solid and real, but if you reach out to touch me, your hand goes right through. There's nothing actually there. This image so struck Jung that he referenced it multiple times in his later work as the perfect description of advanced persona identification. What makes this moment deadly is not just the loss of self, though that's devastating enough. It's what happens when you try to recover yourself. Because once you realize you've been accommodating, your instinct might be to stop completely, to rebel against all the ways you've been shape-shifting. But Jung warned that this reactive swing often creates a different kind of problem. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he described what he called enantiodromia, the principle that anything taken to an extreme will transform into its opposite. If you've been over-accommodating, the reactive swing is to become rigid and uncompromising. But this isn't authentic selfhood either. It's just the shadow version of your accommodation, equally unconscious, equally disconnected from your true self. Jung's survival protocol for this second deadly moment is what he called active imagination in service of self-recovery. This is a specific technique Jung developed where you essentially interview your own psyche. You create space to ask yourself questions and wait for genuine answers, not the answers you think you should give, not the answers that would please anyone else, but the answers that emerge from your actual self. In The Practice of Psychotherapy, Jung described this process in detail. You might ask yourself something as simple as, "What do I actually enjoy?" And then notice all the accommodating voices that rush in. "Well, I should enjoy this because," or "everyone else likes this, so." Jung's protocol requires you to gently set those voices aside and wait for the deeper, quieter voice of authentic preference. This is harder than it sounds because that authentic voice has been suppressed for so long that it's often barely audible. Jung compared it to learning to hear a whisper in a room full of shouting. It takes practice, patience, and what Jung called a willingness to disappoint. Because as you start recovering your authentic self, you will inevitably disappoint people who benefited from your accommodation. You'll have to say no to things you've always said yes to. You'll have to express preferences that contradict what people expect from you. You'll have to let people be confused or even upset by your changing responses. And this is terrifying for someone whose entire identity has been built on managing others' comfort. But Jung insisted this recovery work was essential for survival. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his autobiography, Jung wrote about his own journey through this process after his break with Freud. He had been accommodating Freud's theoretical framework, modifying his own insights to maintain the relationship, and when the break happened, he found himself in a period of profound disorientation. He didn't know what he actually believed versus what he had been saying to maintain the connection. It took years of active imagination, of sitting with his own psyche and waiting for authentic responses, before he could articulate his own psychological theories, independent of Freud's influence. Jung believed this process saved his psychological life and allowed him to make his greatest contributions. Let me give you a contemporary example of what this survival protocol looks like in action. You've been invited to a social event. The old accommodating pattern would have you automatically say yes, then spend energy managing your own resistance, talking yourself into enjoying it, and performing enthusiasm you don't feel. The survival protocol has you pause and genuinely ask yourself, do I want to go to this? Not should I go? Not what will people think if I don't go? But do I actually want to go? And then you wait. You wait for the authentic response, which might be yes, might be no, might be I want to go for an hour but not the whole time. And whatever that authentic response is, you honor it. You practice disappointing people when necessary. You practice letting people be confused by your changing patterns. You practice trusting that the relationships worth keeping will adapt to your authentic self. The third deadly moment Jung identified is perhaps the most spiritually and psychologically crushing of all. He called it the recognition of fundamental aloneness. This is different from the loneliness of non-reciprocity we discussed earlier. This is the moment when you realize that no matter how deeply someone loves you, no matter how genuine the reciprocity, they will never fully understand your internal experience. There is an unbridgeable gap between your consciousness and theirs, and you will spend your entire life fundamentally alone inside your own psyche. For empathic people, this realization is particularly devastating because you've spent your whole life believing that deep understanding is possible. You've worked so hard to understand others completely, and you've unconsciously believed that this level of understanding could be reciprocated. And in this deadly moment, you realize it cannot. Jung explored this concept extensively in his later work, particularly in The Undiscovered Self, published in 1957. He wrote, "The individual is not only a single separate being, but also, by nature, a social being. As a separate being, he is absolutely alone, and the more conscious he becomes of his own nature, the more this aloneness reveals itself." Jung wasn't being nihilistic here. He was describing what he considered a fundamental truth of consciousness, that each person's subjective experience is ultimately inaccessible to others. We can empathize, we can imagine, we can get close to understanding, but we can never actually inhabit another person's consciousness. For most people, this is an abstract philosophical point. But for empathic individuals, this hits differently. You've built your entire psychological structure on the ability to deeply understand others. You can feel what they feel, sense what they're not saying, intuit their needs and motivations, and you've unconsciously assumed that others could do the same for you if you just helped them enough, explained well enough, showed them how. This third deadly moment is when you realize they cannot, not because they don't care, not because they're not trying, but because the subjective nature of consciousness makes complete understanding impossible. Jung saw patients reach this moment and fall into what he called existential despair. If complete understanding is impossible, what's the point of connection? If we're all ultimately alone inside our own consciousness, what's the point of relationship? Some of Jung's patients described feeling like they were in a glass box, able to see others but never truly touch them or be touched by them. Others described it as speaking a language no one else could fully understand, no matter how hard they tried to translate. Jung took these descriptions seriously because he had experienced this recognition himself. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote about periods of profound isolation where he felt the unbridgeable gap between his inner experience and anyone's ability to comprehend it. What makes this third moment deadly is that it can lead to what Jung called psychic withdrawal. If deep understanding is impossible, why try? Why extend yourself? Why remain open and vulnerable? The temptation is to close down, to stop trying to connect, to retreat into the only consciousness you can truly know, your own. Jung saw this as a form of psychological death, what he called premature individuation. True individuation, in Jung's view, required both the recognition of fundamental aloneness and the choice to connect anyway. But getting to that both and position requires navigating the deadly moment when the aloneness first reveals itself. Jung's survival protocol for this third deadly moment is what he called the acceptance of the paradox. In Mysterium Conjunctionis, one of his final and most complex works, Jung argued that psychological maturity requires holding paradoxes without resolving them. The paradox here is this: you are fundamentally alone in your consciousness, and genuine connection is still possible and meaningful. Both things are true simultaneously. The survival protocol requires you to stop trying to resolve this paradox and instead learn to live within it. Jung described this as a shift from seeking complete understanding to appreciating partial understanding. Instead of being devastated that someone can't fully understand you, you appreciate the understanding they can offer. Instead of giving up on connection because perfect communion is impossible, you value the imperfect communion that is possible. Jung used the metaphor of two people on opposite sides of a river. They can never occupy the same bank, but they can wave to each other, call across the water, even find ways to send messages. The connection is real, even though the gap remains. Let me illustrate what this survival protocol looks like practically. You're sharing something deeply important with someone you love. You can sense that they're not fully getting it. They're trying, they're listening, but there's a gap between your experience and their comprehension of it. The old you would have tried harder to explain, felt frustrated by the gap, or concluded that the relationship was inadequate. The survival protocol has you do something different. You appreciate what understanding is present while accepting the gap. You might say something like, "I don't think I'm explaining this in a way you can fully grasp, and that's okay. I appreciate you trying to understand." You release them from the burden of complete comprehension, and you release yourself from the burden of perfect explanation. This survival protocol also requires what Jung called self-companionship. If you're fundamentally alone in your consciousness, you need to become good company for yourself. You need to develop a relationship with your own psyche that's rich and textured enough to sustain you. In The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, Jung described this as developing what he called the internal dialogue. You learn to witness your own experience with interest and compassion. You become curious about your own reactions, generous with your own struggles, appreciative of your own complexity. You stop abandoning yourself in pursuit of external understanding and instead provide yourself with the understanding you've been seeking from others. Jung believed this self-companionship was not narcissism but necessity. In Psychological Types, he wrote, "Whoever looks outside dreams. Whoever looks inside awakens." Indeed, the survival protocol for the third deadly moment requires this awakening, this turning inward, not as an escape from connection, but as a foundation for sustainable connection. Because when you've accepted your fundamental aloneness and learned to be good company for yourself, you can connect with others from a place of fullness rather than desperate need. You're not looking for someone to complete you or fully understand you. You're looking for companionship along parallel paths, for fellow travelers who are also fundamentally alone but willing to walk alongside you anyway. Now, here's what Jung observed about people who successfully navigate all three of these deadly moments. They emerge with what he called tempered empathy. This is different from the raw, unbounced empathy they started with. Tempered empathy is empathy that has been refined through the fire of these deadly moments. It's empathy that includes self-protection, discernment, and realistic expectations. In The Development of Personality, Jung wrote that this tempered empathy is actually more valuable than naive empathy because it's sustainable. It doesn't lead to burnout or bitterness. It allows you to remain open and caring while maintaining your psychological integrity. Jung described this tempered empathy as having several key characteristics. First, it's selective. You don't extend deep empathic energy to everyone equally. You practice the conscious discrimination of the first survival protocol. Second, it's boundaried. You remain in contact with your authentic self even while understanding others. You practice the self-recovery of the second survival protocol. Third, it's realistic. You appreciate partial understanding and imperfect connection while accepting fundamental aloneness. You practice the paradox acceptance of the third survival protocol. Jung believed that people who develop this tempered empathy become what he called wounded healers. This is an archetype he explored extensively in The Psychology of the Transference. The wounded healer is someone who has been genuinely hurt, has faced genuine psychological danger, but has transformed that wounding into wisdom. They can help others not from a place of naive optimism, but from a place of hard-won understanding. They know the deadly moments because they've survived them. And their survival provides a roadmap for others. Let me tie this all together with something Jung wrote late in his life that I think captures the essence of these survival protocols. In a letter published in C.G. Jung Letters, He wrote to a patient struggling with empathic overwhelm, "You cannot save anyone. You can only light the path with your own example. And to light the path, you must first survive the darkness yourself." These moments you're experiencing, as terrible as they are initiations. They're initiating you into authentic selfhood, into realistic relationship, into the profound paradoxes of human existence. Do not try to skip them. Do not numb yourself to them. Move through them with as much consciousness as you can bear, and on the other side, you will find yourself genuinely transformed. This is Jung's ultimate message about these three deadly moments. They're not aberrations to be avoided or pathologies to be fixed. They're initiations into psychological maturity. The recognition of non-reciprocity initiates you into discernment. The dissolution of self through accommodation initiates you into authentic selfhood. The recognition of fundamental aloneness initiates you into realistic connection and self-companionship. Each deadly moment, when navigated with consciousness and the appropriate survival protocol, becomes a threshold into a more integrated, more individuated version of yourself. But Jung also warned that these moments can indeed be fatal if navigated unconsciously. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he wrote about what he called psychic death, which is different from physical death, but equally devastating. Psychic death is when someone is alive physically but dead psychologically. They're going through the motions of life but have lost connection to their authentic self, their capacity for genuine relationship, their sense of meaning and purpose. Jung believed that empathic individuals who face these three deadly moments without a survival protocol often end up in this state of psychic death. They either shut down their empathy entirely, becoming hard and defended, or they remain in patterns of self-abandonment that slowly erode their sense of self until there's nothing left. This is why Jung insisted on the importance of consciousness during these moments. You have to know what's happening while it's happening. You have to recognize, "I'm in the first deadly moment," or "This is the dissolution of self Jung warned about," or "I'm facing the recognition of fundamental aloneness." Naming the moment gives you power over it. It allows you to consciously apply the survival protocol rather than reacting unconsciously out of fear or pain. Jung also emphasized the importance of witnessing during these moments. In The Psychology of the Unconscious, he wrote about the necessity of having someone who can hold space for your process without trying to fix it or talk you out of it. This might be a therapist, a trusted friend, or even a relationship with your own higher self through practices like journaling or meditation. The witness doesn't solve the deadly moment for you, but they anchor you while you move through it. They remind you that what you're experiencing is real, valid, and survivable. I want to close with a story Jung told in Memories, Dreams, Reflections about his own navigation of what I would call a deadly moment. After his break with Freud, Jung entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological turmoil that lasted several years. He experienced visions, heard voices, and questioned his own sanity. He was facing all three deadly moments simultaneously: the recognition that his mentor relationship with Freud had never been reciprocal, the realization that he had been accommodating Freud's theories at the expense of his own insights, and the profound isolation of developing ideas that no one around him could understand. Jung later called this the most dangerous period of his life, not because of external threats, but because of the internal dissolution he was experiencing. What saved him, Jung wrote, was his decision to consciously engage with the process rather than try to escape it. He developed the technique of active imagination specifically to navigate this period. He created the Red Book, where he documented his visions and dialogues with his unconscious. He maintained his daily routines and professional work, even while undergoing profound internal transformation. And crucially, he trusted that there was meaning in the chaos, that he was being initiated into something rather than simply falling apart. Years later, Jung could look back and see that this deadly period had been necessary for the development of his most important ideas. The survival protocols he developed for himself became the survival protocols he offered his patients. So if you're in one of these 3 deadly moments right now, if you're recognizing non-reciprocity, or feeling the dissolution of self, or facing fundamental aloneness, know that you're not losing your mind. You're not broken or damaged. You're being initiated. You're at a threshold that requires you to develop new psychological capacities, discernment, authentic selfhood, realistic connection, self-companionship. These are not easy capacities to develop. The process will be uncomfortable, sometimes even excruciating. But Jung believed it was absolutely possible to survive these moments and emerge more whole, more individuated, more genuinely yourself than you were before. The survival protocols Jung developed aren't quick fixes or simple techniques. They're frameworks for conscious navigation of genuinely difficult psychological terrain. They require courage, patience, and a willingness to stay present with discomfort. But they work. Jung's decades of clinical experience proved they work, and the transformed lives of people who have navigated these deadly moments consciously prove they work. You can survive this. You can move through these initiations and come out the other side with tempered empathy, authentic selfhood, and the capacity for genuine connection that honors both your gift of empathy and your need for psychological integrity. If this exploration of Jung's survival protocols resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in these deadly moments, I want you to know you're not alone in this experience. Share in the comments which of these 3 moments you're navigating right now or have navigated in the past. Your story might be the witness someone else needs to make it through their own deadly moment. And if you found value in this deep dive into Jungian psychology for empathic survival, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who might be facing one of these initiations. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is name the experience, provide the framework, and remind each other that these deadly moments are survivable. Thanks for watching, and remember, you're not dying. You're being initiated.